Good afternoon, family. It's just Sister Shia back with another story time session. We're continuing reading this book here, True and False Possession, Paroxysmal Forms of Pseudo Diabolical Possession. We're just going to pick up where we left off in the last video. Okay. Such were the effects of what was called the Grand Secours, but many of the convulsionaries dissociated themselves from such scenes or opposed them. That was the line of one of the most formidable anti-securists, Francois Lefebvre de Coen. She had a great reputation, and she not only thought the Grand Secours to be the work of the devil, but claimed that one day she had distinctly seen Satan crouching on the body of his victim. Such circumstances naturally seemed attributable more and more urgently to the maleficent influence of the demon. Are we so sure, wrote an anonymous author, of the fate of M. de Paris? If it is really a saint who is behind the prodigies taking place at Saint Medard, why does it please a merciful God to cause so many unfortunates to suffer? Innocents in good faith who come to pray through the intercession of a man they believe to be a saint. The very manner in which the cripples try to be cured would seem more striking than the miracles, since in the strength of their obsessions, they themselves stretch out their poor shortened or bent limbs in the attempt to lengthen or straighten them. So a great mystery hung over the faith and the destiny of these convulsionaries, and the riddle inevitably propounded by the solid fact of the convulsions seemed all the more difficult to solve because the unfortunate victims swore that they remembered nothing of what happened during their seizures. Wow, I met a person yesterday downtown. He told me that his wife had seizures every time she went to church. Crazy. God or Satan? That was the dilemma confronting the theorists, both lay and clerical. Nonetheless, there were some who refused to believe in the supernatural origin of the convulsions and put them down to trickery or even to the major neurosis hysteria. Thus, an anonymous author declared himself convinced after the year 1731 that the singular manifestations at Saint Medard did not depend on any intervention, divine or demoniacal, but were the effect of purely natural causes. What has always struck me, writes this author, was to see that the majority of the convulsionaries were of that sex which we know to be very susceptible to the impressions of objects, and to have a very mobile imagination, which the slightest things can often excite very powerfully. On the other hand, a certain M. Mapoint, a convulsionary who had been imprisoned in the Bastille, was asked to demonstrate the extraordinary movements of his head which he had made during his attacks. This patient, this patient having very willingly agitated and shaken his head so as to represent them somehow, had at once fallen into convulsions in which he had the most rapid and surprising turnings of the head. Make me think about owls. It is obvious that he did not have them voluntarily, but that the whole nervous system was tense in him and ready to enter into convulsion. And this slight movement of the head had been the occasion of a general release, which had caused these alarming convulsions. Recalling the observations of Thomas Willis concerning hysterical subjects, our author remarks that in contrast with convulsive paroxysms, for example, epilepsy, the patients on coming out of their trance feel no discomfort or exhaustion. When the crisis is over, the patient is as well as before. The attacks, do not affect the health. One cannot but admire the high qualities as observer and critic of this author who wished to remain anonymous. Long before Charcot and his school, he saw clearly that many alleged demoniacs were only hysterical subjects, inclined to suffer the effects of suggestion, that the convulsive paroxysms could be induced or provoked by an attempt at voluntary repetition of the attack, and finally that the trances had no bad effect on the general health. Nowadays, we should draw the conclusion that the manifestations at St. Medard, which many enlightened persons thought to be prodigies, were not all produced by the same mechanism. Some, no doubt, sprang from hysteria major, the demoniacal attack, or Charcot and Paul Richer. Others seem to me to be produced by more or less conscious simulation, by mythomania associated with mythoplastia, while the rest show the effects of mental contagion among the weak-minded. But the influence of the demon is to be sought in vain. The convulsionaries of the Ursuline convents at Loudun. With these scenes, at once picturesque, absurd, loathsome, and pitiful, which developed at the cemetery of Saint Medard, at the tomb of the Deacon Paris, we may associate the events now quite devoid of mystery, which excited so many controversies and violent quarrels at the beginning of the 17th century. I mean, the phenomena of supposed collective possession among the Ursulines of Loudun. In this case, as in the other, a very mixed public, which included fanatics, skeptics, mystifiers, and the merely curious, looked on at very strange scenes, blended of tragedy and comedy, which is to us seem profoundly afflicting. The sad story outlined above of Jean de Berciel, prioress of the Ursuline monastery at Loudun, shows that serious dangers are incurred by allowing persons suffering from convulsions, whatever their nature, to live together. Either the epileptics, by their alarming convulsive paroxysms, induce in emotional and hysterical subjects the reproduction, imperfect but similar and deceptive, of the epileptic attacks, as happened at Salpêtrière before the arrival of Charcot, or else the demonopath, who is subject to lurid psychomotor manifestations, impresses his mark on a whole community. This is precisely what we learn from the story of the supposedly possessed woman at Loudun. In those days, exorcism was not only in common use, but was carried out in public, a course which we now know could only exacerbate the agitation and theatricality of the possessed. Observe that the disordered movements, stamped with delirium of the senses, were an exact reproduction of those known to Greek antiquity in the Sibyl's cave, or the temple of the Pythian oracle. They were the same convulsions so perfectly described by Charcot and Richer, and personally observed by me in a great many patients during the First World War. Their essential traits are as follows. Imagine that after a period marked by rigidity extending to the whole body and gnashings of the teeth, so violent as to break them, there follows a phase of wild, clownish movements during which the convulsive patient expresses rage and fury, shouts, struggles, insults, blasphemes, curses, seems literally mad, and we still have only a faint image of what Charcot and Richard call the major demoniacal hysterical crisis. One would really think that the person was suddenly transformed, that an alien influence was controlling them and providing him with strength, skill, daring, and inventions which his own nature could not provide. This severe attack is sometimes followed by a very particular phenomenon, which observers of the demonopathic attacks have admirably clarified, namely ecstasy. All the muscular storm and the extravagant, picturesque, or terrifying clownishness are now stilled. With eyes open, the gaze fixed on emptiness, the subject seems plunged in a dream, ceases to answer questions, does not react when pinched or pricked. He is really wrapped away from the real world, lost in a sort of sleep, which is nourished by sensorial, visual, and auditory hallucinations. But in a somewhat confused manner, it is possible to guess the meaning of the interior drama of which the patient is both the theater and the actor. Then follows the reawakening, the resumption of contact with reality, without the recent storm leaving the slightest ill effect on the subject's personality, contrary to the effect of epilepsy. I have recapitulated the essential notes of the major demoniacal attack in hysterical patients because this is precisely what we find fully active in those convulsionaries, the possessed of Loudun and elsewhere. Now, as I have already emphasized, the major demoniacal attack, more than any other manifestation, seems liable to diffusion and imitation, especially at certain times and in certain surroundings. The 16th and 17th centuries appear to have been specially favorable to them, but exactly the same manifestations occurred at the tomb of the Deacon Paris, at the Salpêtrière in the time of Charcot, and later in the neuropsychiatric centers of France during the 1914 through 18 war. As early as 1630, most of the observers scarcely believed in levitation any longer, but they were still impressed by the grotesque contortions, the wild gesticulations, the acrobatic exploits displayed by the unfortunate religious, and not least by their mother prioress. I need not repeat the description given by M. de Neon and already quoted on page 41. Critical and clinical study of the state of consciousness during paroxysmal possession. There is no need to exaggerate but the great advances made in our knowledge about the eternal problem of self-knowledge, of our consciousness, our ego, our underlying personality are undeniable. But if we imagine ourselves back in the epoch in which the demonopathic incidents occurred, we shall be less astonished at the singular errors of judgment made by observers. Man's nature was conceived as made of a body and a soul, the soul being indivisible and immortal. And so, when a human being appeared to be transformed in his personality, it could only be by some process beyond the reach of human nature. The appearance of several alternating personalities in the same person could not yet be imagined. And when the behavior of a person who did not seem to be a real lunatic struck everyone by its singularity and wild vagaries, men were led to look for its cause either in divine action or in some diabolic power, since all our acts derived from God or from the devil or from ourselves. Take, for example, a woman who falls suddenly into lethargy or catalepsy, her limbs preserving the rigidity of marble or bronze. One may prick or pinch her, and she remains unconscious until a breath on her eyes recalls her to life. Or take a girl who, in contrast with her usual behavior, her position as a nun, her constant piety, utters insulting, obscene, and blasphemous words, who gesticulates, falls to the ground, and shakes herself with the utmost immodesty. Yet, when the attack has passed, she recovers an apparently normal equilibrium. It is credible. People would then say that this transformation of the personality of this quote unquote ego, whose permanence is the essential condition of the continuity of the psychological life, does not prove the intrusion of another occult entity, which can only be diabolical. Certain skeptics I know asked whether some fraud did not take place, which could have explained the supposedly demoniacal manifestations. But all the observation, imperfect as it was in those days, giving us nothing precise, seemed to attest the absolute sincerity of the subject. We may add that often the observers only remembered as much of the subject's behavior as they wished to find there. On the other hand, they had not progressed beyond the doctrine of Descartes, according to which the soul, though it acts on the body, cannot directly affect the body of another. So that even such phenomena as telepathy and telekinesis, which certain modern scientists and philosophers admit to be possible or probable, were not envisaged. It was therefore absolutely necessary to fall back in the last analysis on the influence of a supernatural entity, God or the devil, and especially Satan. We of today have come a long way from the Cartesian psychophysiology, which denied souls to the beast and mocked so wittily at Jean de La Fontaine. What Descartes refused to see in man was the fragility of his personality, his passive division, his successive transformations in certain persons. In short, the whole field of that psychological activity which is subconscious, subliminal, or unconscious. Let us return to the state, or rather states, of consciousness of those subjects we are obliged to consider neuropathic or hysterical demoniacs. One first point is undeniable. Certain demonopathic crises or attacks are purely theatrical. The subject is simply a more or less clever actress and often a mythomaniac in action who remains lucidly aware of her vagaries. Marie Therese Noblet, after a great convulsive attack, sufficiently dramatic to make Friar Escherman think she was in her agony, asked him ironically, "Father, weren't you afraid?" like a mother amusing her child. At other times, the state of consciousness is quite different. The patient leaves the world of reality in order to plunge into a world which can best be compared with that of dreams or hypnosis. The possessed person acts, it is said, like an automaton. Yes, but with this difference that while consciousness of the self is suspended, consciousness of the external world, such as an animal possesses, persists. The demonopathic state, in short, appears quite like that of the somnambulist of the hypnotized person. This explains the fact that while the epileptic, in the course of a psychomotor attack, is capable of wounding himself seriously and even killing himself. The hysteric does himself only superficial damage, even though the blows he gives himself when, quote, the devil has hold of him appear very violently. But if, as I remarked earlier, the crises are intensified, or if the major demonopathic attack, so perfectly described by Charcot and Richer, comes on, consciousness of the self is weakened and extinguished. Rather, after the manner of epilepsy, though the two kinds of crisis should never be confused. Two patients, famous for their convulsive and theatrical attacks, who were studied by Charcot and Richer, were themselves able to distinguish certain attacks they called their wrigglings from others which were the major attacks. They could even foretell from the intensity of the phenomena of the aura the kind of attack they were going to have. They much preferred the major attacks to the wrigglings. In the former, they completely lost consciousness, while in the latter, they lost it only for some moments at a time during the epileptoid period, and complained that they suffered the most fearful torments imaginable. After reading the following description by Paul Richer, it is impossible to doubt that hysteria major exactly reproduces all the disorders we have described among the most typical cases of possession. All of a sudden, appalling cries and shrieks are heard, the body alive with motions of contortion or stiff in tetanic immobility carries out strange movements. The legs cross and uncross, the arms are turned back and seem twisted. The fists are clenched, some of the fingers are clenched, some extended. The body bends and rebends in an arc of a circle or folds and squirms. The head is thrown back to the right or left or held far back, displaying a swollen neck. The face expresses fear, anger, madness by turns. It is swollen, purple. The eyes open wide, remain fixed, or roll in their orbits, often showing only the white of the sclera. The lips are parted, are drawn in opposite directions, revealing a swollen, protruding tongue. When anger seizes her, she hurls herself at the obstacle, trying to overcome it, strangle it, bite it. Often she turns on herself. She pulls out her hair, scratches her face or her breast, tears her clothes, and during this distressful scene, accentuates and accompanies it with cries of sorrow and rage. The patient has completely lost consciousness. After Charcot's death, during that period which too often follows the death of great men and might be called the period of ingratitude for their memory, many neurologists, under the influence of Babinski, one of the most eminent disciples of the master of the Salpêtrière, came to doubt the sincerity of these major theatrical manifestations and wondered whether the whole scene were not produced at will. On this point, the skeptics must have been undeceived by what they observed in the great neurological centers during the 1914 through 18 war. In fact, the major hysteria, as described by Charcot and his pupils, was seen to revive. In company with my lamented friend, Dr. Henry Claude, I myself observed many examples of the major hysterical attack. Then, as formerly, one witnessed a living drama, and the spectator could not help being frightened at the violence of the blows the poor patient inflicted on himself, heedless of partly healed wounds and risking breaking a callus in course of cicatrization. On a final analysis, on the basis of the cases I directly observed during that war with Henry Claude, I support the opinion that Um, I support the opinion that though certain hysterical attacks may not considerably or at all affect consciousness, there are others. Lord, is that you blowing trumpets? Okay. So I directly observed during that war with Henry Claude. I support the opinion that though certain hysterical attacks may not considerably or at all affect consciousness, there are others which disturb it deeply. After the attack, so the patient declares, and we may believe him, he has forgotten everything which occurred in him and around him during the crisis. This is the conclusion reached also by R.K. Osterich, although my thesis differs notably in some points from his. According to Osterich, the possessed do not always or even generally preserve a clear consciousness of their fits. It is the demon alone which expresses itself by their mouths during their fits, and the normal individuality has totally disappeared. In support of this thesis, Osterich, Osterich quotes the cases of demonopathy, very well reported on by Eschenmeyer, who, on the ground of 8 personal observations, professes that the loss of consciousness must be regarded as the essential characteristic of a certain type of possession. The sudden loss of consciousness and a total ignorance of what has taken place during the fit, such are the criteria of the type of possession I have in mind. It should be added that the cases on which Osterich bases his thesis are the more instructive in that they are those of childhood, that age which is so sensitive to suggestion, hypnosis, somnambulism, and neuropathic accidents. But we must be careful to note that if the dissolution of conscience during hysterical paroxysms were as complete as in epilepsy, the patient would scarcely experience any of the feelings of possession, even if he had externalized its most apparent manifestations. It follows then that some traces of the change of personality remain in the consciousness and memory, and this, in fact, is proved by analysis of the facts I have personally observed. A little girl of 10 was going on pilgrimage to a celebrated chapel in her district when she thought she saw in front of her the figures of Our Lady, the child Jesus, and Saint Joseph. The image was so clear that the child was afraid to go forward on the path for fear of hurting the child who was playing in front of his parents. Later on, she saw demons, the damned, the flames of hell. She described them very well and in perfect sincerity, sharing these visions first with her brother, then with her mother. We note that this child, devout and well balanced, was so surprised to find herself favored with such visions that she asked at first if she had not been dreaming. In fact, the sight she saw was like the most appalling nightmare. She says that after seeing Jesus hanging on the cross near his mother, she saw the ground open and a great billow of smoke appeared mixed with flames. There she saw people in heaps weeping and groaning. all mixed together. And if any of them tried to rise, the devil, seated on a throne, armed with a long fork, pushed them back into the fire. The devil was all red, with red eyes, a red tongue, etc., pointed wings and horns. The child was very frightened and disturbed for days after this vision of devils and hell. But it must be added that although this child, whose visions went on for a long time, preserved the clearest possible recollection of the scenes which had impressed her, sometimes the cataleptic attitude disappeared suddenly. The child fell to the ground, seeming to sleep for so long that one day she was found on the ground by some workmen who were passing that way. She would remain in ecstasy, her mother said, for hours, unable to say how long this state had continued. In spite of the great frequency of the apparitions, this child was not deeply disturbed in her conduct, but the influence of these visions on others was not long in taking effect and even became alarming. Here is another example, this time of a nun whose life, in some respects, resembles that of Sister Jean of the Angels. Like her, this sister was nominated prioress of her order considerably in advance of the legal age, which means that her conduct was considered specially edifying. Now, this religious, on falling into ecstasy, excuse me. Now, it's funny because as I'm reading this book about demons, if you know the story of what is it, the Pied Piper or the Andromedary, I forget what it's called, but he comes in with music and on a some kind of animal. I don't know if it was a donkey like Jesus or whatever. But it's no coincidence. Nothing is a coincidence. So it looks like they're coming my way. It's some guys. Yeah. So I'm gonna take a break and I'll be back because clearly the devil doesn't want me to read 24 the 333 on the live time, 2:40 on the clock, 24 elder. So I'll be back, guys, when the devil goes away. Shalom.